Good morning. So today I'm going to read from Hal Draper, from a piece by Hal Draper, titled "Toward a New Beginning on Another Road: The Alternative to the Micro-Sect." I'm going to, I might try to read through the whole thing, or I might have to only do part today and part tomorrow. I'm not quite sure how far I'll be able to get. But before I do, just a few points. So I'm not going to begin with any kind of biographical or contextual introduction. I'm not quite prepared to do that. There is a bit of introductory material at the beginning, if you're unfamiliar with Hal Draper or the significance of this piece in its time. This piece and another essay, which I'll read subsequently, have been rediscovered recently within the last few years and have become quite popular in certain circles of the contemporary left. Popularity which I think is questionable as to whether or not it's based upon a kind of serious grappling with the substance of the problem Draper was addressing and trying to begin proposing some means of resolution to. I do recommend, if you want some context, however, there is a panel that was put on by the Platypus Affiliated Society last year in 2019 at the Left Forum, titled Beyond Sect or Movement, and I'll post a link to that in the comments below after the stream is over. You can Google that and you should be able to find both an audio recording and a transcript in the Platypus Review. And in particular, there was a presentation on that panel by a senior Platypus member, Spencer Leonard, which is a really, it's concise, but a really nice overview of Draper and the place this essay and the other essay I mentioned occupy in his career. So I definitely recommend listening to or reading that if you need some background on this piece. I'll also just mention that yesterday I posted the first in what will likely be quite a long series, perhaps years-long series, in which I read aloud from Draper's magnum opus 5-volume work, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, piece by piece, as in chunks. I did about an hour yesterday covering the foreword to the first volume, and I plan to do hopefully about one of those a week. I posted that on this project's Patreon page, which is patreon.com/socialistlegacy, where you can go to support this project if you're able to and feel inclined to do so. So thus far, the only perk I have up is the first video in that series, and the coming videos will also be behind that paywall. But for the most part, I want to focus on publicly available free content for this project. I did think it would be a nice perk because that's something I've wanted to do for a long time, and it's quite an undertaking to read through that entire 5-volume work. So it'll take time. I also just want to mention now that, and I might have mentioned this in the last video as well, but I am going to be moving at the end of this month, which might put a strain on my ability to produce content as regularly for this project. So I might fall back to a kind of less regular schedule for a little while, but I hope to get back to a regular posting. Maybe, not daily necessarily, but I would like to post at least something most days of the week. So that should be corrected by probably like mid-December or so. So Yeah, and if you have any feedback on the project, anything you'd like to see, any questions you have, feel free to contact me through this Facebook page or on YouTube, or any other channels. There's a bunch of different places you can find me on the internet, Patreon. So, and I should also just say I'm really grateful for all the support. A lot of people have been watching these videos and giving me feedback already. I've already gotten quite a lot of support on Patreon, so it's been really great. And this is, I'm still kind of figuring out exactly what this project is. I definitely want to continue reading texts, more so texts from the older tradition than from the 70s, 60s, and 70s, which, between these pieces by Draper and the Monty Johnstone I read recently, there isn't, in my opinion, a whole lot from the later period, like the 60s and 70s and afterwards, that's as interesting to me and as worth putting out there in this kind of format. I'm more interested in unearthing kind of the forgotten elements of the older socialist tradition, but these are a few pieces that I thought would be good to start with because they help get at the problem that this project is in a way helping or attempting to help address, which is the liquidation of the memory of the old socialist movement, and hence of the legacy of socialism as a not only intellectual but practical prospect. So these are some texts, these pieces by Draper, and I'll probably read a few others as well. And the Johnstone, maybe a few others. They kind of give some context as to how I'm approaching this project. And from there, I will mostly probably focus on older texts, especially from the Socialist Party of America, circa 1900 to 1920, but also other periods as well, and other, other socialist parties. I would like to go back into the older 19th century tradition as well, including, going all the way back to the beginning of the utopian socialist currents, and probably some of Marx and Engels as well. And as important as Marx and Engels are, there is obviously far more attention on them than on other elements other elements of the socialist tradition, whether contemporary with them or preceding them or following them. And I do think that Marx and Engels deserve the prime place that they tend to be given, but unfortunately, I think they are misunderstood and misrepresented by those that kind of champion them today, the contemporary Marxists. And so often the limelight that they're given actually has sort of a distorting effect upon what it is used to present. So I'm not quite sure how to go about addressing that. I mean, there are already audio recordings of most of the classic Marx and Engels texts out there. So, and same with Lenin as well, for example, and Trotsky for that matter. And I don't want to just rehash things that people are already familiar with necessarily. I do aspire with this project to eventually move beyond simply reading through materials well, let me just give a little bit of a rationale for why I'm doing this before I move on to the text. So I'm reading materials out loud, partially because I would be reading them to myself anyway, and I actually find it helpful to read aloud and even to re-listen to those recordings as a means of kind of taking in a text. There also was back before the era of recorded sound and distribution of recorded sound, and radio and things like that. It was actually quite common, including in radical labor and socialist circles, for people to read aloud from periodicals or pamphlets or texts to each other, and not just within radical political circles, but just kind of more generally, culturally, it was common to read aloud from texts, in part because literacy was less evenly distributed than it is now. Although, maybe it's not so evenly distributed now, I'm not sure. So it was a way of making text more accessible to people, but also because it was a way of imbuing them with life and having turning them into a means of connecting socially with others. So you'd have people reading from the Socialist newspaper, at the workplace aloud to their fellow workers, for example. And I see this as, to some extent, trying to draw upon that spirit as well. And I also, in addition to doing research for myself and kind of bringing these texts to life for my own benefit and looking to put them out there for others that might be interested, I am trying to draw attention to certain things, things that I think get neglected. And I don't want to just do that through reading texts aloud. I also want to digest them and reflect on them and give my thoughts on what I'm researching. But I see this as kind of the early stages of a larger research project that hopefully will culminate in a kind of reflection. I want to say comprehensive, although I don't know if it'll go in that direction at this point or not, but some sort of wide-ranging retrospective reflection on the socialist legacy, based on my own assessment, and not just my own, but an assessment that I've inherited from others as well, going back to, Marx and Engels themselves, and Lenin, and the Frankfurt School, and the Platypus Affiliated Society, where I got my education in Marxism. I want to kind of digest and produce some kind of, to some extent, comprehensive reflection on the socialist legacy as it has been inherited and filtered through this unfortunate situation, namely the failure of socialism in the 20th century. So, this is the earliest phase of the project. I'm still kind of figuring out exactly how I'm going about doing it and what I'm trying to do, and more kind of researching and producing kind of elementary reflections on a lot of this material, rather than trying to make any kind of comprehensive statements at this point. I have already and probably will continue to broadcast some of my own reflections, but I think of those as more kind of preliminary. So I'm trying to educate myself on this tradition, and I thought it would be helpful to do that education publicly in a way that others could join me in educating themselves and, hopefully become inspired to educate others as well. But at this point, exactly what am I trying to learn? Exactly what do I hope others learn? It's not entirely clear. What is clear to me is that this legacy of the socialist movement is extremely important, but that importance is ultimately negative at this point. It's ultimately a negative significance in the sense that it was the failure of the socialist movement that produced the world we live in now. And my hope, my inclination, my intuition tells me that it's only through understanding that failure and transcending it that we can overcome the limitations that constrain and constrict the world in which we live, and that render even the most even the best aspects of this world tainted with a kind of miserable residue, and that obviously infects so much of this world with misery, un you know uncut with any kind of redeeming qualities. So anyway, to put a finer point on it, I'm sifting through these materials to get a better grasp of this legacy for myself, and to kind of fill out this hypothesis concerning the significance of the socialist legacy as a negative significance due to its failure. And I don't know what it would mean exactly to transcend that failure. I have my suspicions, but I do think I'm relatively certain that whatever it would require, it will certainly require understanding. It will certainly require consciousness of what went wrong, and hence what was originally sought after, and why it was and remains unaccomplished. And not only unaccomplished, but in a sense, why did it result in the opposite of what it was seeking? In a situation in which not only do we not live in socialism, we live in a kind of capitalism that has lost the prospect of its own transcendence as an element in the practical and intellectual life of society. So hopefully by bringing some sense of that prospect back intellectually, at least, it will aid in whatever transcending it might mean going forward. I certainly think that it would mean, or I suspect that it would mean, the rebuilding of a socialist party, a mass socialist party, internationally, but especially in the United States and the advanced capitalist countries, and the working class rallying to the banner of that party, taking power as a class on an international scale, and using that power to transform capitalism into socialism, using the means of enslaving labor to transcend labor, to transcend a society of labor, to establish a society of freedom, of true freedom, beyond the realm of necessity, beyond the realm of the struggle for survival. So, I think that's what it would mean, but I can't just make that happen myself. Nobody can. And this piece in particular, and the other piece I'll read on related piece, which I'll read tomorrow or whenever I've finished with this one, which is called The Anatomy of the Micro-Sect, are Draper, who, just for a very brief biographical note, was a dedicated revolutionary, a dedicated Marxist his entire life. And towards the end of his life, having witnessed the collapse of the New Left after participating in it from a very early phase, Draper kind of was taking stock as one of the elements of the New Left that he was involved with began to pull away from his own insights into what went wrong, and he was sort of reflecting on, well, where do we go from here? Given that not only did we not reconstitute a mass socialist party that was capable of leading the working class to political power, but now we seem in an even worse position than we were before. So I won't speak for Draper anymore. I'll let him speak for himself. So Okay, so without further ado, Toward a New Beginning, on Another Road, The Alternative to the Micro-Sect, by Hal Draper. Introductory Note. This is a discussion article on the historical background of the problem of the sect form of organization and its alternatives, and I hope it will be helpful in orienting thinking on the subject. It is not presented for adoption by anyone or for any kind of vote. The fact that this has to be said explicitly is a reflection of some sect habits of functioning. On the other hand, it certainly does point to the organizational course which our committee now intends to pursue. But, to understate, this course also arises from sources other than purely historical considerations. This article may be helpful in giving an idea of the flexible possibilities inherent in the non-sect course, but it provides no models for blind copying. It will be enough if it enforces just the following conclusion. There is a road to a revolutionary party, which is not the road of the sect. This line of thought is not a product of the moment for me. On the historical side, it developed particularly from two experiences of the last 2 years or so. One, in the course of working out a presentation of Marx's politics, as I have been doing, I have had to think out an interpretation of what Marx and Engels thought they were doing in this field. 2. At the same time, I went through the interesting experience of reading Lenin's collected works from Volume 1 through Volume 20, up to World War I, mainly in order to make sure if there is any factual basis for the standard fable about Lenin's party concept. There isn't. Naturally, this reading was not taking place in a vacuum, for the everlasting problem of how to build what was also being present. It will be obvious that what is included below is only the presentation of a line of thought, and not an attempt to prove it. Hal Draper, 1971. A short historical note. Although this essay was written for a specific polemical purpose in 1970, its subject, how to organize a mass revolutionary party of socialist opposition to modern capitalism, is one of immediate and pressing concern to any serious socialist. And, as evidence of this, the essay has already gained a fairly wide distribution without any serious attempt to publicize it. Nevertheless, its origins make some references unclear. In particular, the reader cannot help wondering who the "we" are who are referred to throughout the essay. This small note is mainly designed to answer this nagging question. The political career of the author, Hal Draper, has been sketched elsewhere. In part, the "we" refers to his comrades of the Workers' Party, especially when the reference is to Union activity during the period of the Second World War. But the political tendency referred to found new recruits in the left wing of the Socialist Party, the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1950s and 60s. Since these new recruits considered themselves to be joining an ongoing third camp political tradition, references to this period also use "we." Like all polemical essays, this one is easier understood if the immediate background is filled in. With the self-destruction of the student anti-war movement in 1968 through 69, thousands of people were looking for a new direction. Among the various fractions and splinters of the New Left, the verbal commitment to the working class as an abstract concept was replaced by a move to go to the workers themselves. But this was a movement of students, overwhelmingly of middle-class background, whose knowledge of the American working class and its institutions, insofar as it existed at all, was based on what their bourgeois professors told them. Since what they had been told was that the trade unions were dominated by narrow-minded and corrupt bureaucrats with no social concerns, these students entered the world of work with the quite explicit notion that the immediate enemy was not the employers, but the unions. The student activists who made up the majority of the membership of the various third camp political groups were no exception in this regard. This was an extreme case of a sickness that has plagued the socialist movement from its beginnings. The following essay was directed at this immediate audience. Unfortunately, the attitudes and politics of this audience are still quite widespread, even if they are expressed in less extreme form. And the organizational practices that follow from these politics continue to plague the movement. Which is why this attempt to point to a different road for the socialist movement is important. Ernie Habakern, 1998. The problem is still how to build a revolutionary socialist party. In the US, no appreciable progress toward this goal is visible in the last third of a century, since the end of World War II. The goal is still there, but the road to this goal can hardly be considered immune from re-examination. The road we have been on leads up a blind canyon. We have to go back to pick up another road, one which forked off a certain distance back. The road we have been slogging along has a name. It is the road of the sect. We will define this. Note, sects and sectarian have as many different definitions as there are political viewpoints. Here, of course, we are concerned with a Marxist definition. For example, denunciation of sects, as of sectarianism, is standard for all reformists. To them, sectarian simply means revolutionary Marxism, and a sect is any revolutionary organization. This empty literature causes a certain amount of confusion. For one of the silliest examples, see Louis Kozer in Dissent, Volume 1, Issue 4, 1954. We will see how and when it got started, the road of the sect. And we will explain why it leads to getting lost, i.e., to where we are now. We will argue that history shows there must be another road, a different road. In fact, without thinking the problem through, we did get started on a different road in early 1964, when the Independent Socialist Committee was formed to revive independent socialism as a political tendency by encouraging the formation of local clubs. The first Independent Socialist Club on the Berkeley campus was formed in the fall of 1964. But we did not then think it through as an alternative to the sect type of organization. As a result, the barely nascent independent socialist movement slipped back into the sect rut as a result of easily identifiable pressures. We propose to think it through now. Section 1. Let's start by going back to Marx. There is no question about what Marx's views and practice were on this point. In fact, he probably overreacted. So intense was his determination to have nothing to do with any sect, including a sect of his very own. To Marx, any organization was a sect if it set up any special set of views, including Marx's views, as its organizational boundary. If it made this special set of views the determinant of its organizational form. Neither Marx nor Engels ever formed or wanted to form a Marxist group of any kind, that is, a membership group based on an exclusively Marxist program. All of their organizational activity was pointed along a different road. According to their thinking, what should you do if you agreed with their views? How should you try to implement these views? Your task would be to carry those views into the movements and organizations naturally arising from the existing social struggle. Your task would not be to invent a higher form of organization out of your head. Your task would be to permeate these class movements and organizations with your views. In the process of doing so, to develop cadres of revolutionaries in these movements and organizations, and thus to work finally raising the movement as a whole to a higher level. The movement as a whole. Marx and Engels knew and said that this process might, and indeed would, probably involve splits. They made no fetish of unbroken unity as a condition of the process. But the splits which they considered natural were not the artificial splits of an ideological wing which is out to unfurl an abstract programmatic banner. The splits they expected were those arising organically as the mass level rose. They expected such splits from two directions. From bourgeoisified elements who objected to a class line and a class struggle course of development of the movement, and from sect ideologists who saw the class movement moving away from their own special nostrums and prescriptions for it. They expected that either such elements would split away, or that the healthy class elements would have to split with them. But however it came about formally, the line of organizational demarcation was never to be special programmatic views of an ideological vanguard for its own sake, i.e., program in the abstract, but rather the political meaning, in terms of ongoing social struggle, of the political level of the development reached by the movement of the class, i.e., program in the concrete, program as concretized in the real class struggle going on. Thus, during 1847, Marx and Engels, who had joined the Communist League, worked to rid it of its sectarian and conspiratorial hangovers, and succeeded handily. But at the very same time, in Brussels, where he lived, Marx devoted his organizational efforts to building the Democratic Association, which was not even programmatically socialist. And when the revolution broke out on the continent, their first move was to dump the Communist League, dissolve it, as the vanguard vehicle of the organizational operation. In Cologne during the revolution, they operated, organizationally speaking, on 3 levels, not one of which resembled a Marxist sect. 1, in the left democratic movement, Democratic Union. This part of the picture has nothing to do with our present problem, being related to the problem of policy in a bourgeois democratic revolution. 2, in the Workers' Association of the city, a broad class organization. And 3, in their own political center. And what did they create as their political center? Not an organization at all, but rather a newspaper and its editorial board. That is, a voice. And it was this editorial board which functioned as the Marx tendency, which regarded itself as such, and was publicly regarded as such. With the ebb of the revolution, and after returning to London, Marx did agree to the reconstitution of the Communist League temporarily, but soon, by the fall of 1850, Marx saw that the revolutionary crisis was over, while the majority of the membership reacted to frustration with a severe case of sectarian infantilism. The League then split and fell apart. Marx never repeated this experience. During the 1850s, Marx and Engels made no effort to set up anything, but concentrated exclusively on producing and publishing the literature which was to make possible the education of a cadre. This period came to an end only when the working class movement itself threw up the ad hoc organization which we know as the First International. The First International was so polar distant from the sect concept of organization that it never even clearly came out for communism, and barely endorsed a version of economic collectivism at a later Congress. And it was so broadly inclusive within the framework of a clear-cut class character that no one would dream of duplicating today. In any case, the approach which it evinced was the 180-degree opposite of the sect. Instead of starting with the full program and then assembling the band of chosen around it, from any class strata, especially intellectuals, Marx wanted to start with strata of the working class that were in movement, moving in class struggle, even if on a low level, and adapt the program to what these strata were ready for. This was the way to start. Section 2. Marx, the negative side. Within this broad class movement of the First International, Marx and Engels set up no political center of their own of any kind. And it is this which raises the question of overreaction, not their disinclination to create a Marxist sect. In effect, Marx used the General Council, and his influence in the General Council, as his political center. It would be easy to explain why this was not enough. Probably Marx felt that any other course would impede his personal influence in the General Council. But the price was that the formation of a definite Marxist cadre was still in a less than elementary stage when the International went under. This negative fact, not the failure to create a Marxist sect, but the failure to build a Marxist cadre of any kind, is one of the background reasons for the way in which the various socialist parties arose in the different countries, even the so-called Marxist parties. Take England, right under Marx's nose. The first Marxist center of any kind was established by a man, Hindman, in hostility to Marx and to the small circle of English socialists directly influenced by Marx. A man who established this Marxist center as a typical sect of the worst kind, and whose disastrous influence on the patterns of English Marxism has not been overcome to this day. No alternative kind of Marxist political center was ever offered by Marx or Engels or by any of their circle. The result was that the embodiment of Marx to the British public was a man who was the cruddiest founder of Marxism of any country in the world. The obvious alternative to the sect would have been what Marx did in Cologne, the establishment of an organ by Marx's British friends, a publication acting as the voice of Marxist ideas, a model of how to address oneself to the class movement, an organizer of a cadre. Nothing like this was done. There was a vacuum. The Hindman sect operation stepped into the vacuum. While Eleanor Marx did brilliant work as an organizer of the New Unionism, militant mass unionism, organizing the unorganized and unskilled trades, she did it as an individual, with no other visible point of reference. While she and Aveling did good work in spreading advocacy of independent working-class political action in London's proletarian ghetto, with an impact which eventually helped produce the Labour Party, yet their work could not have the concomitant effect of helping to select out and train up a Marxist cadre, which would do more of what they were doing. This failing, the failure to establish any kind of visible political center, even if not in the form of a sect, was later repeated, with less excuse, by Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, while in Poland her Polish comrades established a sect, not a class party. Marx's very extreme detestation of the sect type of organization did not mean that he was unable to recognize the positive contributions made by some sects. He did not have to fall into this one-sided appraisal of the historical role played by some sects, any more than his hatred of capitalism ruled out credit for the great positive contributions of capitalism to the development of society. Just as the Communist Manifesto offers what has been called a paean of praise to the historical benefactions of the bourgeoisie, so also Marx and Engels were often glowing in their praise of the contributions made by the utopian sects. They did not waste any time deploring the fact that these contributions were first made by sects, and sometimes rather grotesque sects, like the Saint-Simonian religion. For they understood the pressures which pushed socialist ideologists into this sect form. All the more important, they thought, to push in a different direction, to orient socialists toward a different organizational road. Marx summarized this in a well-known letter in 1871. The International was founded in order to replace the socialist or semi-socialist sects by real organization of the working class for struggle. On the other hand, the International could not have maintained itself if the course of history had not already smashed sectarianism. The development of socialist sectarianism and that of the real labor movement always stand in reverse ratio to each other. So long as the sects are justified historically, the working class is not yet ripe for an independent historical movement. As soon as it has attained this maturity, all sects are essentially reactionary. For all that, what history exhibits everywhere was repeated in the history of the International. What is antiquated tries to reconstitute itself and assert itself within the newly acquired form. And the history of the International was a continual struggle of the General Council against sects and against amateur experiments which sought to assert themselves within the International against the real movement of the working class. The point is not to try to determine a priori on exactly what date the sect form becomes reactionary, etc. That can't be done. Marx set out to struggle for his own road to a revolutionary movement, and that meant setting himself foursquare against the sect idea. That the possible contributions of a sect were not entirely historically exhausted in 1864 was amply proved in hindsight, but it is irrelevant to Marx's course. The Lassallean sect in Germany, see Marx's remarks in the same letter, or the above-mentioned Hindman sect in England, continued to play a role, alas. A role which also had a positive side as long as there was no working alternative. Unquestionably, sometimes a sect may be better than nothing, but that piece of wisdom does not point to a line. On the other hand, the socialist sect of German-American émigrés was, in Marx and Engels' view, worse than nothing, and they hoped it would smash up and disappear. Unfortunately, it is still with us a century later, the SLP, the Socialist Labor Party. As an aside, it might still exist among a couple of people. It did as recently as, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. I know they have a website, so somebody's maintaining that at least. Anyway, back to the text. So it does not follow, even from Marx's all-out abhorrence of the sect form, that all sects are always equally harmful. The reverse is true. There is naturally a tremendous variation in this regard. If we look nearer than Marx's example, the Ohlerites, a micro-sect which splintered from the Trotskyist sect in 1935, contributed nothing to the development of a revolutionary movement except a subject for hilarity, which is not to be sneezed at in grim times. On the other hand, we shall mention, the Independent Socialist League worked out the essentials of the revolutionary socialism of our day. That is quite a difference. But it does not gainsay the only conclusion we want to point to at this juncture. There is a road to a revolutionary party, which is not the road of the sect. I'll just note, if you're not familiar, the Independent Socialist League was the successor organization of the Workers' Party, which was a split from the Trotskyist Party, or the Trotskyist sect in Draper's language. In the United States, the Socialist Workers' Party of America. In 1940, a significant part of the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party split off under the leadership of Max Shachtman, and Draper was one of those who split off, as were a number of other figures who had become famous figures in the 20th century Marxist tradition, including C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya, who was the founder of Marxist humanism, Grace Lee Boggs, also associated with that tradition, and several others as well that you'd probably be familiar with. So Draper followed Max Shachtman in forming the Workers' Party, which by the end of the 40s came to the conclusion that it was not actually building a party, and it was not a party as it claimed to be. And so it renamed itself the Independent Socialist League in recognition of what it really was, which was, in their terms, a propaganda group. And that organization, the Independent Socialist League, would endure throughout the 50s until at the beginning of the 60s or at the end of the 50s. It joined what was left of the Socialist Party of America, which was not much. It was sort of a shell of an organization at that point, and took over the Socialist Party under Shachtman's leadership, with the intention of using the repute of that organization to essentially realign, in their terms, the constituencies of the Democratic and Republican parties, which at that time were configured still on the basis of the New Deal coalition that supported Roosevelt in the 30s, and that opposed him, but sort of as a loyal opposition in a way in the Republican Party. So Shachtman and his group were trying to reorient the base of the Democratic Party by bringing the civil rights struggle, which up until that point had been politically represented by the Republican Party, into the Democratic Party, which itself contained was itself seen as the political representation of the labor movement, going back to the World War II and to the New Deal, when Roosevelt won the labor movement's kind of support and loyalty. And the Democratic Party at that time also was still the party of the Jim Crow South, the segregationist South, the Dixiecrats. So the Shachtman project was essentially to unite the civil rights struggle and the labor movement inside the Democratic Party, and to drive the Dixiecrats out of the Democratic Party, pushing them into the Republican Party, which was the party not only of civil rights, but of the kind of the big capitalists, the big business interests. So that way you would have a kind of middle-class liberal labor party in the Democratic Party, opposing a party that united the capitalist class and the racist Dixiecrats. And in that sense, you'd have a much clearer political division from which you could eventually start rebuilding a socialist opposition, which would, in a sense, recognize the limitations of the liberal labor alignment, and push beyond those limitations for independent working class political action, independent of the middle class elements in the Democratic Party. And that would be the basis for eventually rebuilding a socialist party. Sort of a convoluted scheme, but essentially the Shachtmanite assessment was that the confusion of mainstream politics, with the labor movement being united with the Jim Crow South and the civil rights movement being united with the capitalist class, made it impossible to it made any kind of clear development in the direction of socialism impossible, because there were these confusing obstructions in the way. Draper broke with Shachtman and his group in the early 60s over this realignment strategy, which he saw as anathema to the entire Marxist legacy of independent working class political organization. So he went on to form his own group, which he already mentioned earlier, the Independent Socialist Clubs. And those would go on and eventually become a sect of their own, as he said. But so the Independent Socialist League was an organization that Draper was in the 50s, which was a sect, but it was, in a sense, a sect that had kind of come to terms with the delusion that a sect in and of itself is what at the time was called a small mass party, which is a theory within the Trotskyist or the Shachtmanite tradition, that this kind of small membership organization could grow into a mass party eventually. They kind of realized that that wasn't going to work. So they formed an explicitly propaganda organization. That's what the Independent Socialist League was. And so that was kind of a phase in the development of Draper's understanding of this problem of sectarianism. And I think he comes back to that later, if not in this piece, then in the other piece that I'll read, The Anatomy of the Micro-Sect. But anyway, I just thought, since that came up, it was probably useful to clarify that history. That's history that, just to finish this aside, that history I do intend to explore in more detail eventually in this project, The Socialist Legacy, which, despite my intention to focus on the Socialist Party of America, I do think that there is a lot of... I do have a great interest in exploring specifically this tradition of American Trotskyism and its and then the split of the Shachtmanites and Draper's trajectory out of that, but also the other currents that came out of that. That'll probably be more down the road, though, because I want to lay more groundwork with exploring the older socialist tradition before I do that. But we'll see how it goes. Okay, so end aside, and back to the text. Section 3. Anatomy of the Sect. To sum up, we have seen 3 approaches so far. 1 we can throw out. The approach of confining oneself only to individual militants without any political center. The real problem is whether the political center must necessarily be a sect. It is a question of the relationship between the vanguard and the class, not merely of 2 organizational forms. The sect establishes itself on a high level, far above that of the working class, and on a thin base which is ideologically selective, usually necessarily outside the working class. Its working class character is claimed on the basis of its aspiration and orientation, not its composition or its life. It then sets out to haul the working class up to its level, or calls on the working class to climb up the grade. From behind its organizational walls, it sets out scouting parties to contact the working class, and missionaries to convert 2 or 3 here, 2 here and 3 there. It sees itself becoming, one day, a mass revolutionary party by a process of accretion, or by eventual unity with 2 or 3 other sects, or perhaps by some process of entry. Marx, on the other, saw the vanguard elements as avoiding above all the creation of organizational walls between themselves and the class in motion. The task was not to lift up 2 workers here and 3 there to the level of the full program, let alone 2 students here and 3 intellectuals there. but to go after the levers that could get the class, or sections of the class, moving as a mass onto higher levels of action and politics. The sect mentality sees its sanctification only in its full program, that is, in what separates it from the working class. If, God forbid, some slogan it puts forth bids fair to become popular, to become too popular, it gets scared. Something must be the matter. We must have capitulated to somebody. This is not a caricature. It is drawn from life. Marx's approach was exactly the opposite. The job of the vanguard was to work out slogans that would be popular in the given state of the class struggle, in the sense of being able to get broadest possible masses of workers moving. That means moving on an issue in a direction, in a way that would bring them into conflict with the capitalist class and its state, and the agents of capitalists and state, including the labor lieutenants of capitalism, its own leaders. The sect is a miniaturized version of the revolutionary party to be, a small mass party, a microscopic edition or model of the mass party that does not yet exist. Rather, it thinks of itself this way, or tries to be such a miniature. In its organizational method is the method of as if. Let us act as if we were a mass party already, to a minuscular degree, naturally, in accordance with our resources. And this is the road to becoming a mass party. Let us publish a workers' newspaper, just as if we were a workers' party. And if we cannot publish a daily, like a real mass party, at least we can publish a weekly or bi-weekly by draining all our resources. This makes us a small, unreal mass party. But such a facade is only self-deluding, since if it ever succeeds in deluding a single worker, he finds out soon enough that there is little behind it. Let us build a Bolshevik party by being disciplined like good Bolsheviks. So, on the basis of a false notion of Bolshevik discipline absorbed from the enemies of Leninism, the sect is Bolshevized into a contracting, petrifying coterie, which replaces the bonds of a political cohesion by iron hoops such as are needed to hold together the staves of a crumbling barrel. There is a fundamental fallacy in the notion that the road of miniaturization, aping a mass party in miniature, is the road to a mass revolutionary party. Science proves that the scale on which a living organism exists cannot be arbitrarily changed. Human beings cannot exist either on the scale of the Lilliputians, or of the Brobdingnagians. Their life mechanisms could not function on either scale. Ants can lift 200 times their own weight, but a 6-foot ant could not lift 20 tons, even if it could exist in some monstrous fashion. In organizational life, too, this is true. If you try to miniaturize a mass party, you do not get a mass party in miniature, but only a monster. The basic reason for this is the following. The life principle of a revolutionary mass party is not simply its full program, which can be copied with nothing but an activist typewriter and can be expanded or contracted like an accordion. Its life principle is its integral involvement as a part of the working class movement, its immersion in the class struggle not by a central committee decision, but because it lives there. It is this life principle which cannot be aped or miniaturized. It does not reduce like a cartoon or shrink like a woolen shirt. Like a nuclear reaction, this phenomenon comes into existence only at a critical mass. Below critical mass, it does not simply become smaller, it disappears. Hence, what can the would-be micro-mass party ape in miniature? Only the internal life of the mass party. Some of it, in a way. But this internal life, mechanically carried over, is now detached from the reality which governs it in a real mass party. Detached... Sorry, my dog decided to make some noise. Detach the guts of a lion from its body, and what you have in reality is tripe. This is why the internal life of a sect has a tendency to be an exercise in unreality, in facades, in ritual imitations. Also, since only the mass party's internal life is available for ritualized parody, the sect mentality finds only internal life congenial. For outside of that internal life, the harsh realities of isolation and impotence are unbuffered and unbearable, having not the slightest resemblance to the external life of a mass party. The internal life of the sect becomes not a necessary evil keyed to its outside activities, but rather a substitute gratification. On the one hand, the mass party worker chafes at the necessity of spending much time at internal branch meetings, fraction meetings, etc., even if he is a good enough Marxist to understand that these things are necessary. The sect mentality, in contrast, finds comfort and zest only in such ingrown activities where suitably revolutionary talk can be enjoyed, whereas a trade union meeting is just a drag. I'm a little over an hour in now, and I'm about halfway through, but I think part of the time I spent was me talking about my own concerns and not reading from the text, so I think I can power through, so I'm going to try to do that. Okay. Section 4. Well, what about the Bolsheviks? But didn't the Bolshevik Party have to develop from a sect to a mass party? If they can do it, so can we. No. That is not how the Bolsheviks became a mass party. Not by the road of the sect. And there is no proposal for a sect form of organization in What Is to Be Done. The whole mass of fairy tale history about Lenin's party conceptions is an invention of the professional anti-Bolsheviks and Stalinists. However, we obviously cannot go into that here. The following will suffice to present the problem. Take the route embodied in What Is to Be Done. In the preceding period, the preliminaries for a mass party had taken shape in Russia in the form not of sects, but of local workers' circles, which remained loose and founded loose regional associations. They had not developed as branches of a central organization, but autonomously in response to social struggles, loosely. What Lenin set out to organize abroad, first of all, was not a sect, not any membership organization, but a political center, a publication, Iskra, with an editorial board. The Iskra tendency was embodied as an editorial board, not a sect. The membership organization to which Lenin looked was to be a mass party, not one consisting exclusively of those who agreed with his revolutionary Marxism, but rather a mass party broad enough to include all socialists, indeed, all militant workers. It would have different tendencies within it, and the consistent Marxists might be a minority, at least for a while. But while Lenin did not make the mistake of proposing to interpose the walls of a sect between his tendency, i.e. the one with the correct line, and the broad movement of the class in struggle, he also did not make the other mistake, the mistake of neglecting to build a political center, and thereby a Marxist cadre. It was the Mensheviks and right-wingers, not Lenin, who split rather than permit a left-wing majority. Nor in the years of the Bolshevik Party's formation did Lenin make a virtue out of necessity. He did not adopt the view that the party had to be limited to Bolsheviks. On the contrary, he fought consistently for the conception of a broad party in which, however, the left wing had as much right to take over the leadership by democratic vote as did the right wing. This is what the Bolshevik leadership split was all about on the organizational side. Of course, the state of illegality in which the movement functioned conditioned organizational forms in many ways. But it is not illegality that determined that Lenin refused to take the form. But it is not illegality that determined that Lenin refused to take the road of forming a Bolshevik sect. If Iskra had been set up in Petrograd instead of abroad, the essential relation would not have changed. In fact, when partial legality was attained for a short period after the 1905 revolution, one of the consequences was temporary fusion of the Bolshevik and Menshevik groups in a united mass party, though Lenin retained a political center in the form of a publication and its editorial board. The onset of a measure of legality did not push Lenin toward a Bolshevik sect formation, but in the opposite direction, toward unity with the Mensheviks in a mass party, not unity of the ideological political centers. But weren't both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks factions of the split party? Yes, formally speaking, they were. But a faction meant something else again in those days. On both sides, as well as for other organized tendencies in the Russian movement, a faction functioned as a public political center, with its own publication and editorial board, as the carrier of its politics. Nor were these factions, Bolshevik as well as Menshevik, membership organizations in the sense of sects we have been trying to build. In the sense of the sects we have been trying to build. Look at the documents written by Lenin shortly before 1914, when the Socialist International Bureau was inquiring into the Bolshevik-Menshevik unity question. Lenin, to prove that the Bolsheviks had the support of a majority of the socialist workers in Russia, gives statistics on circulation of organs, financial contributions, etc., but not membership. Nor did anyone expect membership figures. For the membership organizations in Russia were local and regional party groups which might be part Bolshevik and part Menshevik in sympathy, or might shift support from one to the other from time to time, etc. Every time a party congress or conference was held, each party group had to decide whether to attend this one or both. What this points at is the fact that both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks were, in organizational form, not membership sects, and not even factions in any organizational meaning relevant to today. What were they? Both were political centers, based on a propaganda publishing enterprise, plus a central organizational apparatus for forging links with sections of the workers' movement through agents, literary collaborators, etc. This plus is a crucial addition, though we do not dwell on it at this point. Individual members in Russia, or party groups, might decide to distribute Lenin's paper, or the Menshevik organ, or neither. Many preferred a non-faction organ, such as Trotsky put out in Vienna. Or they might use in their work those publications of the Bolsheviks which they liked, plus those of the Mensheviks and others on a freewheeling basis. Obviously, much of this scene was conditioned by illegality, much of it by the nature of the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, etc. It is not we who propose it as an automatic model for us today. We are discussing it for the very opposite reason, because there are some who, erroneously thinking that the Bolsheviks developed in the shape of a sect, erroneously propose the Bolshevik-type sect as a model. But there never was anything like a Bolshevik sect. That invention came later, after the Comintern. In any case, it is obvious there must be the following tentative conclusion. If the Bolshevik Party did not develop as a revolutionary party through the road of the sect, then there must be another way. In fact, the historical conclusion goes farther. There is no revolutionary mass party, or even semi-revolutionary mass party, which ever became a mass party by the road of the sect. That does not prove there never will be. That does not prove by itself that it is forever impossible for a sect to evolve into a mass party in some organic way, that is, without at some point realizing it is on the wrong road and taking a different route. But we are not interested in proving that. All that needs to be understood is that there must be another road, a road which was in fact actually taken by revolutionary socialists, and with more or less success. What is proved is that the road of the sect should not be followed uncritically, without thinking it through, as if it were the only one possible or thinkable. On the contrary, the road of the sect has never worked up to now at all. What has worked is quite a different road, one which therefore at least deserves consideration. Section 5. How and when the sect form was revived. This other road dropped out of the consciousness of most revolutionary Marxists only relatively recently. That is, during the Comintern period. The big historic development which dropped the curtain over it and pushed the sect route to the fore was the post-World War I period of evolution in which the Comintern first posed the formation of revolutionary parties as an immediate emergency necessity. In every country, a revolutionary party had to be constituted forthwith, even if the party had to be hothouse forced. This was demanded by the Comintern's 21 points. The motivation was clear. The world revolution was on the order of the day for all of Europe, and it was true that the world revolution was on the immediate order of the day in Europe. But we now know that it proved to be flatly impossible to forge genuine revolutionary parties by a short-order forcing process. At any rate, not revolutionary parties capable of victory. This is the essential reason why the enemy, primarily the social democracy, was able to defeat this European revolution. And the defeat of this revolution was the turning point of modern social history. All of the world today flows from it. I'm going to repeat that because it's so important. The defeat of this revolution was the turning point of modern social history. All of the world today flows from it. The best-known consequence was the rise of Stalinism, the Stalinization of the communist parties as well as of Russia. A bisymmetric consequence hit the currents that rejected Stalinization or broke with it. They generally saw the degeneration of the movement as the consequence of Stalinization, instead of seeing Stalinization as the consequence of the defeat and degeneration of the movement. On the basis of the former view, revolutionary success was seen simply as depending on the forging of a vanguard leadership that was not Stalinist, that was truly revolutionary. That is, on the forming of a vanguard leadership that had the correct line, which would be enough. The hothouse forcing process of setting up a revolutionary party by issuing its own 21 points, detached from the objective context of the real 21 points, was taken as the given by a new generation of revolutionaries or would-be revolutionaries, for whom history had begun in 1917. The result was a first wave of Bolshevik sects, that is, sects that tried to ape what they thought was Bolshevik, in the first period of the decline of the European Revolution. A typical example was the Italian Bordegists and other offshoots of the infantile leftists of the Comintern, the trends that Lenin had attacked in his left-wing communism and infantile sickness, or infantile disorder. The translation's more popular now. For one thing, as is well known, these well-intentioned but quite ignorant leftists then knew nothing about how the Bolshevik Party had really been forged. For them, the 21 points ultimatum was not a special emergency measure, one which arose from sensible revolutionists only in the not very common situation of having an immediate revolutionary crisis breathing down one's neck without a revolutionary party in existence. For them, this emergency measure, this desperate emergency measure, became the norm, the regular Bolshevik thing to do. To do even if there did not exist the historical situation which alone explained why the 21 points had to be resorted to. Generalized as the normal pattern, this hothouse road to a revolutionary party, or facsimile thereof, went like this. You raise the banner of the correct program to establish your organizational boundary. You do this regardless of the objective situation, for it is a supra-historic imperative. You do this with whomever you have around, 2 other good people, for example. For was it not said that in the dark days of the war, Lenin's Bolshevik Party was reduced to a handful? You declare yourself the revolutionary party, and since you have the correct program, eventually, the workers will have to come to your door. And you have your sect. Section 6. A quick look at the Trotskyist sect pattern. Trotsky's reluctance of several years against breaking with the communist parties was conditioned, among other things, on the fact that he too saw no alternative but the formation of a Trotskyist sect, a conclusion he was loath to take. It must be remembered that during the whole period of his political development, i.e. before 1914, Trotsky had never begun to understand what it was that Lenin was doing. For decades he had fought bitterly against Lenin's organizational course, which he had denounced as a splitting policy. What was the splitting policy that horrified him? It was the course of forming a distinct political center around one's full and correct program. not basing a sect on the full program, but rather a political center. Trotsky's course as an organizational conciliator in the Russian movement meant that he too, like Luxembourg and Germany and most of the Second International left, never understood the nature of Lenin's road to a revolutionary party. During most of Trotsky's political life, the only organizational course he could understand was either the course of the sect and splitters, which is how he interpreted Lenin, or else the swamp of facetious party unity mongering. It is ironic that the Stalinization of the communist parties forced Trotsky into the road of forming his own political center, the left opposition, inside the communist parties. That is, inside a Stalinized movement which tolerated no oppositional political center whatsoever. The road that he had denounced inside the pre-war Russian social democracy, where it had been possible, was the one he was compelled to take inside the Stalinist movement, where it was impossible. It is not very surprising, therefore, that when the Trotskyist groups could no longer continue the organizational form of a left oppositional political center within the communist parties, they naturally adopted the only other form they knew, the sect. Trotsky did so very unhappily, without any doubt. That is why the next experiment was with the entry into the social democracy, in the hope that a non-sect road to a mass party could be found there. The hoped-for substitute was the incubation of a revolutionary party cadre in the mass movement which the social democracy was supposed to represent. It would be digressive to pursue this story further here. The point we are interested in is this: that before and after this entry experiment, the unthought-through acceptance of the Bolshevik sect pattern produced a profusion of micro-sects, peeling off from the Trotskyist macro-sect of the 1930s on. In the US, in addition, the absence of any mass political movement of the working class made it so much the harder to see any other road. Section 7. The Workers' Party and Independent Socialist League experience. There is one other case that demands immediate discussion, since it is the case of our immediate ancestor, the Workers' Party / Independent Socialist League of 1940 through 1958. In outline, though it deserves lengthier discussion some other time, the case goes as follows, in 3 stages. 1. Formation of the Socialist Workers' Party out of the Socialist Party. The Trotskyist entry into the Socialist Party, gestation in the womb of the social democracy, was aborted by the end of 1937, when Trotsky, and with him part of the Trotskyist leadership around Cannon, decided that the world, including the US, was on the point of entering a revolutionary situation. This immediately triggered off the 21 points pattern. At least this time the motivation was a felt emergency situation too. By this pattern, as we have seen, the Revolutionary Party must at all costs be announced to the world, its banner and program unfurled, in good time to anticipate the sweep of the revolution. The SP right wing was just as anxious to expel us as Trotsky was for getting out. The actual result was a collaboration. In any case, by the beginning of 1938, the Socialist Workers' Party was declared to the working class of the United States, and later, the same year, the Fourth International was likewise hothouse forced into existence. There was no ambiguity about the way the new party regarded itself. It was the revolutionary party, at last vouchsafed to the world, and it would grow by swift accretion until it was the leading force in the working class, hopefully in good time to lead the developing revolution. By unfurling the full and correct program, the sect, i.e. the party that actually existed, would shoot down the road to become a mass party. The outbreak of the war punctured this unquestioned view in two ways. What is best known is that the full program did turn out to be full of something, but not correct. Defense of the Soviet Union, Hitler-Stalin Pact, emergence of Stalinist imperialism, invasion of Finland and Poland, etc. More pertinent here is the second issue that figured in the 1939 through 40 fight that rocked and split the organization, the so-called organizational question. For what happened, as we detailed at the time in a lengthy document titled War and Bureaucratic Conservatism, is that the sect which called itself a party reacted to the outbreak of the war like a sect. We did not understand it that way then. We called it bureaucratic conservatism in the canon leadership. This sect response was acted out far more plainly by the SWP after the split than at the outset. The SWP went through the entire war period like a shellfish. It crawled into its shell to protect its jelly-like body and announced the policy of preserving its cadres by putting them on the shelf, along with the shelf fish, for the duration, instead of seeking to find ways and means of hardening its cadres in struggle during the war. 2. In complete contrast, the Workers' Party which we formed after the split followed a course which can be described as that of a small mass party. But we really acted like a small mass party and did not merely talk about it. That is, the WP moved energetically and militantly into activities which would be undertaken by a mass party if one had existed. Excellent revolutionary oppositional and shop work in the plants and trade unions, accompanied by mass circulation, distributions of an agitational popular weekly, etc. To be sure, this mass party work could be done only on a relatively small scale, or, what is the same thing, on a bigger scale only in a few very limited local situations. For we were a very small mass party. The underlying assumptions were still the same. Revolutionary crisis by the end of the war, or thereabouts, and rapid growth along the lines we were working. This course could seem to make sense, if only temporarily, for obvious conjunctural reasons. We were the only sole and exclusive socialist opposition tendency in the working class movement for this whole period of the war. This is a monopoly position which has not existed for anyone since then. Industrialization or proletarianization of our membership had been made relatively easy by the war situation, for those who were not drafted. It is not unimportant to mention also that because of industrial wages, a dedicated membership, and an astronomical income tax dues system, financing the work was never easier. In short, for this limited period and special situation, the contradictions of a sect acting as a small mass party could be and were glossed over in the heat of activity. It can perhaps be argued that if the outcome of the war had been revolution in Europe and America, as anticipated then, this course would have been historically justified. I am not interested in arguing this, since I am not interested in maintaining any theory of inevitability about all this, nor in arguing that if we had been smarter we should have done something else. None of this is to the point, and I mention them only to throw them out of the discussion. I am interested at this point. I'm interested in it at this point. I'm sorry, it's a little. This is a little garbled here. I'm interested at this point only in explaining how and why the course of a small mass party sect was temporarily and conjuncturally possible and hopeful. 3. The day of reckoning came by 1946. This year marks a watershed. As it dawned, it was becoming clear to most that the looked-for post-war world revolution had been aborted, or at any rate, was not going to come off. A basic reorientation was forced on us. It was therefore in 1946 that a final reckoning took place within the systematic sectarian group in the WP, the Johnsonite clique. Johnson was the nom de guerre of CLR James, and the Johnsonite clique was CLR James and Raya Dunayevskaya and their followers in the Workers' Party. This was a clique with a faction program, indeed, any number of programs to suit any occasion. In 1946, the Johnson clique faction reacted formally to the new turn of affairs by asserting twice as vehemently that the revolution was around the corner. Soviets might be expected in 2 years. Capitalism had collapsed all over Europe, and power was rolling in the streets. In other words, with the typical fantasizing of the sectarian mentality faced with unpleasant reality. Accordingly also, they unfurled a program which counterposed struggle groups, then called factory committees, to the now counter-revolutionary trade unions, which had been statified, etc. With this rigmarole, these systematic sectarians then packed up and moved into the SWP, where they did very revolutionary factional activity for a brief moment, before unfurling their banner to the whole world in a sect of their very own, which then bifurcated, etc. The same year, there was another attempt at reorientation in the Workers' Party by more serious people. This was an effort to theorize and systematize, i.e., think through, the small mass party conception of the organizational course, not simply as the ad hoc reaction to the circumstances of the war, which is what it had been, but as a general and timeless concept, applicable now even more than before. The phrase small mass party was invented and written down. It was rejected by the organization. Out of this discussion, and with the steady descent of the U.S. political situation into the doldrums, Cold War climate, then McCarthyism, etc., the organization had to face up, without any self-deception, to its future as one sect among others. In a thesis presented in 1948, and discussed until adoption in 1949, the organization overwhelmingly accepted a few basic truths. That it was not a party, except in name. That no socialist party existed in the country. That all the socialist groups, including ours, were in reality sects. At best, propaganda groups. That one could only hope to be a good sect, a sensible sect, rather than a stupid, phantasmagorical, and self-deceiving sect. That although history made nothing but a sect possible at this time, one could determine not to carry on a sectarian policy with relation to the working class and its movements, and other concretizations of this approach. Accordingly, the organization changed its name from Workers' Party to Independent Socialist League. All this was very sensible as far as it went. I think the ISL was the best and most sensible sect possible, but that didn't help it for more than a few years as the 1950s dried up the entire left. The ISL did not shake itself apart with monstrosities and sectarian fantasies. It merely withered on the vine and then dropped off. While other socialist sects went through political contortions, the SP dwindling to nothing, the SWP transforming itself into a Stalinoid appendage. Section 8. What is a political center? Since all of the history discussed above was acted out without any self-examination, without any analytical differentiation between this road and that, it all has to be differentiated in hindsight. It would appear from the above account that, in practice, the establishment of a political center as distinct from a sect, i.e., a non-membership propaganda/educational center as distinct from a membership group enclosed in organizational walls, has taken the concrete form of a publishing enterprise and its editorial board, with more or less an organizational apparatus attached to it for the purpose of carrying out the political tasks of the center. The fact is that this route has been even more common than the above account might indicate. The contemporary U.S. shows several examples that repay a quick look. It is true that the radical scene seems to be strewn with sects, but in addition there are several tendencies which are not organized in the form of sects, but in the form of political centers around a publication. One, perhaps the most effective for its politics, has been the political tendency represented by the Monthly Review, i.e. the somewhat amorphous spectrum of Stalinoid politics independent of the CP. While the magazine has been both the expression of an While the magazine has been both the expression of and organizer of a political tendency, yet has not moved toward organizational membership crystallization, except in some tentative efforts at local groups of friends of or associates or something like that. The same has been true, more or less, of The Guardian. It is doubtful if these elements even had or have a distinct perspective of someday contributing to a revolutionary party. They certainly think primarily in terms of permeating the left with their specific ideas. Another relatively successful example is Liberation, but at the cost of what were originally its own politics. This magazine was set up as a political center for the absolute pacifist tendency. As such, it has been a nullity. Absolute pacifism was never deader. In fact, it turned into something else, with pacifism only one crouton in the soup. Since its politics is confused, it is not very important as a political center. It has maintained itself mainly a diffuse radical journalism. 3. Dissent was founded more or less consciously as an effort to maintain something of a political center without a sect organization by people who had become social democrats in a country without social democracy. Later, dissent and the LID, the League of Industrial Democracy, sort of merged. The LID is an interesting example of what was originally a membership organization which, as its membership disappears, turned itself into a political center type of operation, social democratic in politics, but not around a magazine. The New Leader has been another kind of example of a social democratic CIA wing operation of a political center without a membership organization. All these cases, in their specifics, are strongly conditioned by their sources of finances. As an aside, I think the most obvious example to point to today would be Jacobin magazine, which is a political center of an especially whose political stripe is, in my opinion, especially repugnant. And obviously its main concern is permeating the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and influencing the political orientation of that sect. So it's not, it may, in a technical sense, embody the pattern of the political center that Draper is discussing here, but like these other examples, it doesn't have an especially fecund political orientation that it's propagating. It's, in a sense, propagating confusion, and doing so primarily within the ranks of what is currently the largest and most popular, in the sense of most visible sect on the left, the DSA. So it's a nullity as well, in my opinion, despite its popularity. But it is an example of a political center in the sense that Draper is discussing. Back to the text. In fact, almost any political journal tends to become a political center of a sort by its very nature, since it is a dispenser of ideas. I have mentioned several disparate examples. This transcript I'm reading off of Marxists.org, which, by the way, if you want to read it yourself, you can find it there, is rife with spelling errors and transcription errors, unfortunately. So I apologize, I keep stumbling. It's kind of hard at times to make out exactly what the text is supposed to say. So anyway, I have mentioned several disparate examples that indicate there can be quite a variation. There is no organizational model we can simply copy. The point is to get the general idea of a course that does not involve the building of a membership sect, and then work it out to express our political aims and views. The first thing that is distinctive about the course we want to take is this. We want to build a political center which has as its goal the formation of the prerequisites of a revolutionary socialist party. And the final section. 9. What is it that we want to accomplish? Lenin's organizational accomplishment was the following, if we try to abstract all national peculiarities of place and time and conditions. The painstaking formation of the Bolshevik tendency accomplished 3 things in the course of time. 3 things which, it seems to me, apply in almost every case, and certainly apply to what we are obliged to do. The process of formation of the Bolshevik tendency, 1, created a body of doctrine, a body of political literature expressing a unified kind of revolutionary socialism. 2, formed cadres of party workers and militants around this political core. 3, established its kind of socialism as a presence in left politics with its own physiognomy and name. This sums up our tasks too. There is no real need for us to try to foresee or predict now exactly how the Revolutionary Party of the future will come into being. However it happens, it is only insofar as these 3 tasks are accomplished that the results can be favorable. If our tasks are thought of under these heads, then certain activities take on different significance and priority. For example, the publication of literature is thought of by a sect as one activity among others, and not one with a high priority. With one exception, it tends to be pushed to the bottom of the agenda. The exception is the publication of a mass organ, which tends to take so much precedence over everything else that nothing else can be done. From our point of view, this is a grave mistake in priorities. The creation, publication, and distribution of a basic body of literature is the accomplishment of a political center on which everything else depends. It is the key means to the end. The first task of this basic body of literature is to make possible the formation of the cadres, to provide the political nourishment on which cadres can be raised. Without it, no healthy cadre formation is possible. Such cadres will of course develop locally. A political center has an enormous advantage over the sect's national committee or central committee, which issues directives, theses, disciplinary cases, etc. to its micro-empire of mini branches. That is, the former's relations with local clubs, socialist groups, trade union groups, workers' groups, and individual activists can be infinitely varied and flexible. But the latter's relations are dichotomized into two types. With members, the relation rigidified by the bylaws. With non-members, a relation hampered by an organizational barrier. So let me read that again because it was a little messy. But the latter's relations are dichotomized into two types. The sect's relations are dichotomized into two types. They aren't infinitely varied and flexible. With members, the relation rigidified by the bylaws. With non-members, a relation hampered by an organizational barrier. After a first period during which a big job of preparation will have to be accomplished, we look forward to far more involvement with local cadres, not less, but in a quite different relationship, which offers new possibilities. It is no part of this article's aim to spell out our program for the next 6 months. We already see far more than we can handle, and that is only to get started. For we will be doing well along these lines if it takes us most of a year to get started. We have to have a long-term perspective. What we have here is not a get-rich-quick scheme, but its opposite. A line of preparation for the future which can bear fruit only after a long haul. We should think in terms of at least a 10-year plan. I mention 10 years because it is a good round figure and is called a decade. We spent the last decade in 2 blind alleys. If by the end of the 70s we have a number of solid accomplishments in carrying out the 3 basic tasks listed above, then we will have taken the first appreciable steps toward the goal of a revolutionary party. So that's the end of this piece. So hopefully tomorrow I'll come back and read the second piece that follows on this theme, the anatomy of the Micro-Sect, which is mostly a recapitulation of a lot of the points made here, clarification of some points, expansion on some of them. It's not exactly a revelation. I think this piece contains most of the seeds of what Draper was getting at anyway. I have to say, unfortunately, obviously, if decades on now, almost half a century on. Wow, half a century on from this piece's moment. Obviously, what Draper was recommending was a road not taken. Draper's comrades in the independent socialist clubs and the international socialist tradition would not follow his lead, his guidance, but they went the opposite direction. They formed sects. They formed the ISO, which recently dissolved. They formed Solidarity, which still exists in some sense, but has basically become just a current within DSA, another sect. And Draper spent the rest of his life working on his 5-volume magnum opus, which I mentioned at the beginning, in an effort to clarify the meaning of Marx's politics, his revolutionary politics. And that work, though it has been read and it has received, accolades for being one of the great works of scholarship on Marxism, Marxism in particular, in its day, and even in the history of scholarship on Marx, it's not really read the way I think he meant it to be read, which is as informing the preparation of a new generation that would take up where his generation failed, and find this other road he was describing. Now, another point that needs to be made, and Spencer Leonard made this point in the presentation on the Platypus panel on Draper and his Micro-Sect essays that I mentioned at the beginning. But Draper's moment was a lot different than ours, in the sense that there was a lot more to look at as the kind of foment from which a revolutionary working class politics could develop. We are at a much lower level of possibility in the present. Things have degraded substantially over the last 50 years in terms of what could be drawn upon, in terms of the movement of the class struggling and coming into conflict with the capitalist class and its state. That's not to say there's nothing, but it's at a much, much lower level. And to compound the problem, the socialism and leftism, radical leftism that exists, is not only at a lower level, it has putrefied into something that is outright antagonistic to the very prospect of reconstituting the sort of politics that Draper, held it as, his standard, and that goes back to the old socialist tradition in a lot of ways, even if Draper had certain peculiarities inherited from his particular course of development in the Trotskyist and Shachtmanite tradition. He nonetheless still held true to the old Marxism of Marx and Engels themselves, and of the best elements of the Second International and the early Third International, and the Trotskyist movement, for that matter. We're at a much lower level in terms of the movement of the working class, in terms of its actual efforts to address on its own terms, through its own independent activity. Obviously, that I'm not saying that working class people aren't discontented and aren't making that discontent known in various ways, but the ways in which those discontents manifest are across the board. If they take anything like a potentially constructive form, constructive in just kind of general sense, not necessarily even a political sense, but just in any kind of non-destructive, any form that's not just simply like a lashing out at the world around them. They're just totally integrated into the organs of the capitalist class and the capitalist state, including the trade unions. And Draper makes a big point in this piece and in other pieces from this period that it's wrong to write off the trade unions simply because they're controlled by a reactionary bureaucracy, as if they are not sites in which struggle for leadership of the working class must be conducted. And I agree with that. But unfortunately, it's all well and good to say that. But who's going to do that? Who is going to do that? Who's going to take up that task of, developing a struggle within the existing union movement, both against the employers and the capitalist state and against the bureaucracy? The problem, I think, is that obviously, there are people in the union movement already, working class people that are union members and even leaders in that movement who might take up that struggle. but they are totally disconnected, as far as I know anyway, from anything like a meaningful socialist politics. And they would have to be, because there is no meaningful socialist politics out there. All there is this putrid kind of slime that has resulted from the complete rotting away of what remained of the old tradition over the course of the 20th century. To such an extent that even the sects that Draper was dealing with, to the extent that they still exist, and a lot of them don't anymore, don't really exist in a meaningful way anymore, certainly not the way that they did in the 70s, to the extent that they exist at all anymore, they are kind of among the best. Even at their worst, they're among the best. What you have on the so-called left today now is what I think Mike McNair of the Communist Party of Great Britain called, described as sects of one. You have a kind of sea of sects of one, of people that operate with a sectarian mentality but have no affiliation to anyone else beyond opportunistic alignments that could be broken at any moment, and people can turn on each other at any moment. And this kind of sea of sects of one, to the extent that they're oriented by the socialist tradition in any meaningful way, they have made a total mockery of it in what they understand about it. And many of them have little or no positive regard for the socialist tradition at all anymore. If they do, they may draw upon Mao or Stalin, or at best Lenin, but a really horribly disfigured Lenin, or Marx and Engels. But they would easily disregard anything beyond that, those kinds of pictures of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, those sorts of horrible images. Like, that's their understanding of the tradition. It's not about this broader historical process that has roots going back to the bourgeois revolutionary tradition, and that spans far more than the Stalinist imagination of what Marxism was. So you have this problem, namely that to the extent that there is a lot less to be worked with in terms of reconstituting a socialist current within the movement of the working class, because the movement of the working class is at a much lower level even than it was in the 70s. And to the extent that it's still there, and I don't just mean the unions, but I also mean the potential to constitute new unions or other forms of organization in the course of the working class struggle with its condition of existence in capitalism. You don't have anything like the kinds of cadres or potential cadres that Draper was hoping for, because anyone with any intellectual curiosity about this tradition that ends up getting swept up in it is ruined by what's out there, by the mess, the slimy mess of the so-called left of the present, which is not a left-wing phenomenon in any sense that has some continuity with the tradition other than a superficial continuity. It's really totally reactionary. And it's hard to project any kind of meaningful propaganda or educational signal in this morass. It would be hard to establish the kind of political center that Draper is talking about, because you'll just get lost in this sea of noise, of shrieking and groaning, that passes for left politics today. You certainly won't reach working class people who are not tuned into this stuff, and if they know anything about it are probably outright hostile to it, or swept up in the kind of diluted forms it takes within more mainstream appropriations of it in Democratic Party circles and in the union and among the union bureaucracy as well. These sorts of more diluted, less hysterical, less horrifying forms of social justice, identity politics, and so on. So it's a real problem. It's even the road that Draper was able to see and to point towards as a road not taken, that we should, or in his moment, that he hoped the young people following him would, go back and find and take as an alternative path. That road is hardly even visible now, and even if you can see it, getting to it is almost impossible. Getting to the place where you can go down that road is almost impossible, because you'll just be swallowed up in the the maelstrom of the contemporary left. And you may get there, but will anyone be there with you when you get there? And if not, then what are you even doing? Who are you even talking to? So obviously, or it may be obvious, I think it's obvious that the spirit behind this project, the Socialist Legacy Project, is deeply inspired by Draper's consideration of the political center as an alternative to the sectarian road. But it's shaped by the different circumstances that have intervened in the interim, namely all of these obstacles that have resulted from the further degradation of the left and the further deterioration of the labor movement, and just of kind of social discontent in general since Draper's time, over the last half century. So I'm more concerned not with a political center in the sense of trying to project a political message, educating politically in that sense of this is what needs to be done, because it's not even clear that, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily clear that this is what needs to be done, because when you invoke the socialist tradition, the socialist legacy, you automatically are, what you say is automatically carries connotations that are destructive to the end that you're pursuing if you're engaging with this legacy honestly and seriously. You're immediately swallowed up in the slime immediately as you invoke this legacy, and in a positive way, that is. So I think critical reflection on this legacy, critical consideration of it in a serious way that doesn't pretend to immediate political significance, but that is sober about the obstacles to this significance, to this political prospect, is necessary. And that's informed by my education and participation in the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is also oriented towards dealing with this problem, but in a kind of different direction. It's more oriented toward engaging with the morass of the existing left and using its own, character at present, the dead character of it, this character of it as kind of failing to live up to its own tradition, the tradition that it claims to be in continuity with, as a means of educating people interested, or that might be interested in that tradition, as to what's wrong. So it's about making visible, making palpable, making sensible to young people, young intellectuals inclined to be interested in the history of the left and the present significance of the left tradition, to be sensitive to the problem that obstructs it today in the form of the contemporary left. I'm interested in something a little bit different with this project, although I think it's related, and I would like to think that that project and what I'm trying to do here have a certain symbiotic relationship to each other, because I'm more interested here in unearthing what the old tradition was in depth and bringing it to light so that it can be reflected on in isolation from the concerns of contemporary politics and the contemporary left. So it's not a political center in the sense that Draper meant, in that I'm not trying to permeate the existing movement with a political propaganda as to what I think is the correct program. the correct path. I'm more trying to suggest what that correct path might be by bringing to light its... Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. I'm going to wrap up now. It's more about bringing to light what the old tradition was and what it might mean to recover it today. But that would be a task that would... That's not a task that can be undertaken directly at present. I would like to think that the more people that educate themselves about and reflect upon this tradition and think about what its significance might be today, free of the morass of the contemporary left, the more fruitful a potential positive pursuit of the kind of politics the old socialist tradition pursued might become. Maybe that's a little convoluted, but like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm still trying to work out for myself exactly what this project is. And whatever it is deeply informed by Draper, especially by this piece and the other piece I'll read soon, The Anatomy of the Micro-Sect. And it's informed by those, but it's informed in a mediated way, in a way that tries at least to take into consideration that even the limited project that Draper set out for himself and for his followers in the early 70s has, well, obviously was failed to come to fruition, and the conditions in even which that limited project seemed like a viable way forward have eroded and degraded to such an extent that something even more preparatory and more limited is necessary to reform the conditions in which building a meaningful political center would be possible. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there because I don't know if... Well, I have to move on with my day anyway. But thank you for watching, and yeah, take care.